You know how it is, you want to make smart food choices, right?
Absolutely.
And if you've ever stood there in the rice aisle looking at brown rice, white rice, wondering which way to go, well, you're definitely not alone.
It's a common dilemma.
So today we're doing a deep dive into exactly that, brown versus white rice. But we're going, a bit deeper than just the usual nutrition facts.
Right, looking at some food safety angles, too, based on some new research.
Exactly. You shared the study in Michigan State University, published in Risk Analysis.
That's the one, yeah. It gives us a great jumping-off point to really unpack what seems like a simple choice.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. The common wisdom, for ages really, has been brown rice is healthier. Full stop.
And look, that's not wrong from a nutrient perspective. Brown rice does generally have more fiber, protein, vitamins, stuff that gets stripped away when making white rice.
The bran and the germ, right?
Exactly. Those are removed.
Okay, but this Michigan State study, it adds a really interesting layer, maybe a complication. What was the big finding?
Well, the headline finding is that brown rice, despite those nutritional pluses, tends to have higher levels of arsenic compared to white rice.
Arsenic, okay.
Specifically inorganic arsenic, which is the form that's generally considered more toxic.
Right. Arsenic isn't exactly the first thing you think of when you're grabbing a bag of rice. Why rice, though? What is it about rice specifically?
It really comes down to how it's grown. Most grains grow in relatively dry soil. But rice, usually grown in flooded fields, those paddies,
Oh.
and those wet, waterlogged conditions, they just make it easier for the rice plant to absorb arsenic naturally present in the soil and water.
Huh. So the very environment that's ideal for growing rice also makes it better at picking up arsenic.
Precisely. It's a bit of an irony of its cultivation.
Okay, so we know there's arsenic, especially inorganic arsenic, and brown rice tends to have more. How worried should the average person be? Are the levels dangerous?
That's the key question. And the study's lead researcher, Felicia Wu, she put it into context. For most adults, the levels found in brown rice probably don't pose a major long-term health risk.
Okay, that's reassuring.
Unless, you're eating huge amounts of it every single day for years and years. For typical consumption, a few times a week, say, the risk for most adults is considered low.
Got it. But like with many things, most adults isn't the whole story. The study did point out some groups who might need to be more cautious.
Yes, absolutely. Vulnerable populations were a focus. Infants and young children under 5 years old.
Why them specifically?
It's about body weight. They eat more food relative to their size, so their exposure dose is effectively higher.
Ah, right. Makes sense.
This study actually mentioned a potential harmful risk for kids under 5, even down to 6 months old.
Wow. Okay. Anyone else?
Yeah, also potentially Asian immigrant populations, where rice consumption can be much higher, a dietary staple, and populations facing food insecurity who might rely heavily on rice for calories.
So it's about the dose relative to body size and also just the sheer amount consumed regularly.
Exactly. Those are the key factors for increased potential risk.
Now, another really interesting part of the study was about where the rice comes from. That made a difference too.
A big difference, yeah. This is crucial. They found significant variation in the inorganic arsenic concentration based on origin,
Okay.
and also between white and brown rice from the same region.
Can you give us the numbers? I remember they were quite stark.
Sure. So for white rice grown here in the U.S., about 33% of the total arsenic was the inorganic form.
Okay, a third.
But for U.S.-grown brown rice, that jumped to around 48% inorganic.
Almost half. Okay, and globally.
Higher still. Globally grown white rice averaged about 53% inorganic arsenic. And globally grown brown rice, that was up at 65%.
65%. That's a pretty significant jump, especially comparing U.S. brown to global brown.
It is. It highlights that origin really matters.
And just to be crystal clear, we keep saying inorganic versus organic arsenic. Remind us of the difference again.
Right. Important distinction. Inorganic arsenic is the form linked to more long-term health concerns, like cancer risk with chronic exposure. Organic arsenic, found in things like seafood sometimes, is generally considered much less toxic. Our bodies handle it differently, excrete it more easily.
So the concern with brown rice isn't just total arsenic, but that a higher percentage of it is the inorganic, more worrying type.
That's the crux of the food safety consideration here, yes.
But as Felicia Wu said, we shouldn't just write off brown rice entirely because of this. It still has those benefits we mentioned at the start.
Exactly right. It's vital listeners don't get the impression that brown rice is now suddenly bad. It's still a good source of fiber, protein, niacin, other nutrients.
It's about the whole picture.
Precisely. Wu
Yeah.
emphasized considering both food safety and nutrition. It's not either.
Which leads us to this idea of a trade-off, doesn't it? You get more nutrients with brown rice, but you also get potentially more inorganic arsenic. How did the researchers suggest we navigate that?
Well, they basically called for more research, specifically a kind of cost-benefit analysis for public health.
Okay, what would that involve?
It means looking at everything together. The nutritional benefits of brown versus white, yes, but also the potential health costs from arsenic, the price difference between the two, maybe even the environmental footprint.
A really comprehensive view, not just one factor in isolation.
That's the idea, to get a clearer picture of the overall public health impact.
And research like this, it doesn't just sit in a journal, right? It can influence things more broadly, consumer habits, maybe even policy.
Oh, definitely. Thinking about chronic arsenic exposure over a lifetime and potential links to increased cancer risk. That's serious. This kind of work informs public health awareness.
People might change how much rice they eat or which type.
Potentially. And it feeds into regulatory efforts, too. You mentioned the FDA, they have this initiative, Closer to Zero. And part of that is setting targets or action levels for contaminants like arsenic in foods, especially foods for infants and children. This research provides valuable data for that process.
It really does complicate that simple brown is always better message we often hear.
It does. It challenges that sort of black and white thinking about healthy food, or maybe brown and white thinking in this case.
Ah, right. It shows there are layers, nuances to consider beyond just the front-of-pack claims.
Exactly. It's a reminder to think critically, consider both the good stuff and any potential contaminants, especially for those vulnerable groups.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up for everyone listening. If you had to boil down the key insights from this deep dive, what are they?
I'd say point 1, brown rice generally is more nutritious fiber, protein, etc. Point 2,
Yeah.
but it also tends to have more arsenic, especially inorganic arsenic, than white rice.
And that arsenic level varies.
Right. Point 3, arsenic levels, particularly the inorganic percentage, can differ significantly depending on where the rice is grown, with global sources often showing higher levels than U.S. grown in this study.
Okay.
Point 4, for most adults eating moderate amounts, the risk is likely low. But point 5, there are real potential concerns for infants, young children, and populations with very high rice consumption.
So it's about balance.
Balance, exactly. Point 6, making informed choices means weighing those nutritional benefits against the potential food safety risks, considering your own situation and who you're feeding.
It really drives home that food choices are rarely simple good-bad dichotomies. There are almost always trade-offs.
That's a perfect summary. This research gives us a more nuanced lens to view a staple food.
So maybe a final thought to leave everyone with. Given everything we've discussed, how might you listening think about your own rice habits now, especially if you have young children?
It's about finding that personal, informed balance.
Definitely something to chew on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.